Former President Donald Trump escapes an assassination attempt that's cast a shadow on the US political scene. How polarized is America? What's behind the rise in political violence there? And what are the implications? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Now, a campaign rally in western Pennsylvania turned into a scene of horror on Saturday. Former US President Donald Trump narrowly escaped an assassination attempt. The gunman fired from a nearby rooftop was taken down by Secret Service agents. The FBI has now classified it as a potential act of domestic terrorism. Well, President Joe Biden condemned the shooting. He's expressing sympathy to his opponent in a rare break from the animosity between the two. Could this mark the beginning of a perilous period for political violence in America? Or will the polarization and tension recede amid the wave of shock? We'll get into that in a moment with our guests, but first, this report from Axel Zaimowicz.
This was supposed to be a routine campaign stop. But within minutes of Donald Trump taking the stage, this happened.
Take a look at what happened.
As shots rang out, the former president hit the ground. Secret Service agents swarmed to protect him, while others engaged the assailant. The gunman, later identified as 20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks, had managed to access a rooftop overlooking the rally and fired from the distance. The rifle used in the attack belonged to his father. The FBI says it's investigating the attempted assassination as a potential act of domestic terrorism. President Joe Biden swiftly condemned the attack and called for calm and unity.
Violence has never been the answer. Whether it's with members of Congress of both parties being targeted and shot, or a violent mob attacking the Capitol on January 6th, or a brutal attack on the spouse of former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, or information and intimidation on election officials, or the kidnapping plot against the sitting governor, or an attempted assassination on Donald Trump. There is no place in America for this kind of violence, or for any violence ever.
America has a long, grim history of political violence. From Abraham Lincoln's assassination in 1865 to the killing of John F. Kennedy nearly a century later, the specter of violence has long haunted American politics. This latest attack came just days before Trump is set to accept the Republican nomination for president. It also comes just 3 years after Trump's supporters stormed and attacked the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, highlighting the increasing polarization of American society. Analysts see wider implications.
We're on new ground for, I think, 3 reasons. I think the first is because this shooting happened during a presidential campaign. Secondly, because it's in the 21st century era of social media. And thirdly, most importantly, because the target of political violence is a candidate who has made his political career on the politics of violence. That's the uncharted territory that takes us not only into the election in November, but into, I think, very serious questions about the future of the American political system.
All eyes are now on leaders across the political spectrum. Their response could either heal a fractured nation or push it further towards the brink. Axel Zaimowicz, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring our guests into the show. We have joining us from Washington, D.C., Rachel Kleinfeld, a senior fellow at Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict and Governance program. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, Amy Koch, a Republican political strategist. And in Colchester in the United Kingdom, Natasha Lindstaedt, a professor of U.S. government at the University of Essex. A warm welcome to you all. Let me start with Amy and ask this question. Is the assassination attempt a natural consequence, if that's the right word we can use, to a hardening political atmosphere and environment?
So I think that we have been in a difficult period going back far before January 6th. Our current majority leader, Steve Scalise, was hospitalized in a terrible shooting at a congressional baseball game. And so political violence is not new, unfortunately, to American politics. What I think is contributing.
But it is getting
rhetoric.
more polarized, isn't it, Amy?
It absolutely is. And I believe that, I think that the American people need to look at themselves, but Americans' leaders need to look at themselves, because the rhetoric has been ramped up to a frenzy. And then you have someone who is clearly unwell that then steps forward, really fears for their life, fears for democracy, fears for whatever the leadership, and I give this to both sides, Donald Trump included, but they fear for their livelihood and their lives, and then they do something terrible like this. I'm not saying they're responsible. The shooter is the most responsible, but certainly the rhetoric needs to be cooled, and that can only fall on those with microphones. We need them to step up now and be true leaders.
Rachel, there have been cycles of political violence in US political history, as Amy was pointing out there. Is this part of the, again, if we can use the word, normal pattern of ebb and flow? Or are we seeing something of a different trajectory over the last few years?
That's right. We've had major episodic political violence in our country since the Know Nothing Party tried to capitalize on political violence against immigrants and Catholics in the 1830s. Since the rise of Trump, we've seen a vast increase in threats and political violence used against all sorts of different groups of Americans and political figures and election officials. And while some of that has been from the left, like the Steve Scalise shooting, the vast majority, if you look statistically, has been from the right. And what we're seeing now is the apogee of that. We're seeing probably what looks like intra-right violence, which happens in countries where there's been this kind of polarization. No one is ever pure enough. And also disturbed individuals act, just as the former speaker was saying, and they act when violence has been normalized in a political system, which is what's been happening in America over the last few years. And I really hope it's a moment when all speakers can take a look at themselves and say, do I want to continue fomenting this, or can we take a step back? And particularly for the MAGA faction of the Republican Party that has been really using violence to attack other Republicans and attack a more moderate part of their party, can they be stopped from continuing the kind of rhetoric that's hollowing out the center of American politics?
Well, I'm sure Amy will have something to say about that. But before we go down that road, you mentioned an important word there, normalized, violence being normalized. Natasha, if we look at the stats, do the stats suggest to us in the surveys that something is different this time, that violence is being normalized more than past episodes or bouts of violence? I was reading one survey, 10% think the use of force is justified to prevent Trump from becoming president, 7% saying the use of force is justified to restore Trump to the presidency.
Right, and that's an important study to cite. That's by noted terrorism expert Robert Pape. And the other aspect to mention is that 10% that said, violence is justified to stop Trump, a third of those own guns, and the 7% that said violence is justified to get Trump in the White House, half own guns. So this is a really toxic mix we have in the US with over 400 million guns in circulation in the US, 43,000 deaths by firearms in 2023. In a context where US politics is more polarized than ever, our norms of civility and tolerance have changed. We have a president, speaking of Trump, who urged his supporters to siege the Capitol. 5 people died. And more recently, the Supreme Court, the highest court of the country, has essentially given him the go-ahead to do whatever he wants and has legitimized his actions in many ways. So this is a really critical point in U.S. history where I would agree with the speakers that have already mentioned the importance of our elites talking about tolerance, talking about returning to norms of civility. And while a lot of this polarization predated Trump, he made it worse. He stoked a lot of the fires and he rejoiced in violence against others. He would often urge his supporters to attack protesters. He didn't do anything to stop the siege on the Capitol and basically put a bounty on his own vice president's head. So he has a lot of work to do. I know he said at the National Convention, the Republican National Convention, that he's going to unite the country and that he's completely rewritten his speech. But I'll be really looking to see how much he does change his tone. It has been mostly on the attack, and is he willing to go even a step more than that, which would be to actually accept and say he's willing to accept the legitimacy of our elections. He'll accept the results, because that's critical here. This is why politics has become
Let me jump
so
in, Natasha.
How
did Donald Trump put a bounty on the head? Can you just explain that part of what you said, putting a bounty on the head of his vice president?
Right, I'm speaking more metaphorically here, but there were people chanting, hang Mike Pence, hang Mike
certainly
Pence.
there were people chanting that. I just wanted to, for the sake of accuracy, just to make sure we don't misunderstand what we're saying. Let me take the discussion to Amy. Perhaps what Natasha is getting at, one of the things, Amy, is a loss of belief in the democratic system, where we look at what's happening, people's complaints about vote counting to the Supreme Court. Is there a loss of faith in democracy right now?
So there is not. And on both sides, again, by the way. And what I would just say is that is never, no matter what, a justification for taking a shot at someone. And so what I feel like is, even in this discussion, when we talk about it, and I will tell you right now that Donald Trump has made statements that I find abhorrent and undignified for a leader, and dangerous, as well as others on the other side. And I'm not going to go into them. The point is that no matter whatever the political concern is, to ramp the rhetoric up to the point where people feel it is us and them, survive or kill or survive. That's the kind of rhetoric that we continue to hear. And it is dangerous, it is unhelpful, and it is a tremendous undermining of our democratic system. And so even this discussion here, I want to temper things. When we say he put a bounty on the head of his vice president, now, there were people in that crowd that were saying terrible things. And Donald Trump said things in his speech. And again, I've not been supportive of the former president. However, everyone has to look at their words and think about what they are saying and temper their words and realize that there are disturbed people out there that will do terrible things based on really this awful fear that so many people are fomenting.
You mentioned the word that disturbed people will do terrible things. And I want to come back to that in a moment. But before we do, we'll just keep that in mind if we can. Rachel, are we seeing a loss of belief in the neutrality of state institutions, whether it's the justice system, whether it's the electoral system?
I can't speak to the motives of this individual. As other speakers have said, individuals who commit political violence are sometimes ideological.
Not this particular person, but looking in a broader sense, are you concerned about a loss of belief in the neutrality of state institutions in the wider population, not just this one shooter?
Loss of belief is a passive term. Belief has been caused to be lost in our system. We've had political leaders who have said that they will not accept elections because those elections aren't fair, even when our elections are run extraordinarily well. And that repetition of claims that elections might be fraudulent is what is causing a reduction in belief. When we want to take down political violence, you need three things. You need accountability for those who use it to deter future use. So things like promises to release the January 6th insurrectionists, very unhelpful. The Supreme Court's actions that increase immunity for a president, whomever the next president is, and that decrease the ability to sentence those January 6th protesters, very unhelpful. The second thing you need is societal revulsion. You need a society that really says, have you no shame? We're starting to get that. Majorities of Americans on both sides of the aisle really, really don't want political violence. And while there are lots of bad polls showing high numbers, the actual numbers are fairly low, and the vast majority of Americans don't want it. But the third thing you need is a political incentive structure that reduces the incentivization of using the rhetoric and calls for violence and so on. And the primary structure in American politics in which there are many, many safe political seats, and people run to their right on the Republican side and to the left on the Democratic side. And that is the real election, because the general election is already known after the primary, because so many states and districts are run by one party. What that's doing is really incentivizing extremism. And so when you have a portion of a political party that has been using violence as a way of harming the moderates in their own party, what you get is a continued incentivization to speak towards violence. And so what we have right now is societal revulsion, but accountability is weakening, and the political incentive structure is still wrong.
That's a really interesting group of observations that we need to pick apart. But before we do that, I want to take this question to Natasha. You know, a moment ago, Amy was talking about how disturbed individuals can take matters in their hands and do terrible things. But and I want to be clear, of course, we're not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that the majority of Americans condone political violence or want political violence. It is no doubt a minority, but do the stats show a more worrying trend in terms of wider sections of society actually becoming involved in political violence beyond simply the mentally disturbed, as you could make the case was the case with the shooters of President Ronald Reagan, Gerald Ford, or Andrew Jackson, you know, people who are just mentally disturbed, or as in the case of the shooters with Presidents Truman or Roosevelt, people who are just on the very extreme fringes of American society, extreme nationalists and so on. Whereas when we look today, if we take the incident of January the 6th, is there something to be said for finding wider segments of society, even members of or ex-members of the armed forces being part of this?
Right. It's just that the norms of what's acceptable, the norms of civility and tolerance have changed. Norms of what's acceptable in terms of political violence have changed. And I believe that in large part this is due to the fact that, as I was mentioning before, Trump hasn't accepted the election results and has casted doubt on their legitimacy, though we know they're free and fair. And in doing so, if you look at other countries where, you know, they are struggling with democracy, where there's casting doubt of their elections, political violence often follows. And as we've seen with the siege on the Capitol, and everybody has seen it, and a lot of people may support it, a lot of people may completely disagree with it, and so forth. You see that there's polarizing responses to it. But I would have thought that this type of event would have been the type of event that Americans would have been unified in their disgust of. And you don't see that anymore. That some people think it's justified. It was justifiable what they did. And I think it's really important that Trump agrees to accept the election results, and that we can return to a place where we, you know, accept when the party or candidate doesn't win, that we can deal with that. That's
right.
Critical to any democracy.
All right. And of course, that is an important point. We haven't seen Donald Trump adjust, shall we say, his position on the last round of election results being legitimate. Rachel, both you and Amy have spoken about the importance of Americans taking a second look and calming the rhetoric down. We've seen the presidential candidates, both of them in the last, 24, 48 hours, been urging unity. Do you think this will calm down the political temperature in the country? What's your take, Rachel?
I think there's a possibility of it. As I said, you see widespread social revulsion at what just happened. The commentary from both sides of the aisle is very, very negative toward what happened, with the exception of the political extremes that are still pointing fingers. And if this turns out to be an individual from the right, I think that's a real wake-up call. If it turns out that it's someone from the left, then we're back to the tit for tat kind of finger pointing that we've been in for so many years. But it's a harder,
do you think, Rachel, the candidates are going to recalibrate their entire messaging and branding, so much of which has been blaming the other and casting the other as a threat to American democracy?
The incentive structure of American politics is built around needing to polarize the population in order to get your base out to vote for you. That's how people win elections since the year 2000. You don't run for a general electorate. That's why it's so important to change the incentive structure of American politics. But I do think that because the narrative for this particular shooting might be confusing, it's actually a chance to say, wait, do we really want this? Do we really want this against people that are giving up a lot of their lives to run for office in a democracy? That those aren't easy jobs. It's not just the presidential assassination. It's school board members, it's mayors, it's state legislators, it's governors. It's up and down the spectrum, the level of threats that people are getting and the heightened threat environment that they're in. And what that means is that people's children are getting threatened. So while the media finally noticed when someone tried to take a shot at Trump, it's really important to realize that this is affecting our politics to the very depths of our city level. And it's time for many people to take a look in the mirror.
All right. Amy, what does this mean for the elections? Will it improve Donald Trump's re-election chances?
Well, certainly it gives him a strange momentum, right? President Biden is, having to tone down all his campaigning, put that on pause. Of course, the RNC would be a time for him to do that anyway, because this will be Trump center stage. And so the timing for Trump, it helps drive his message on a campaign that was already leading. And what I would say to the former president, that this is his moment to step up and be a leader and exude some leadership that I frankly have seen that has been lacking. 2020 is in the rearview mirror. Leave it there. Joe Biden won and has been president for 4 years. January 6th was a terrible moment in American history. There were a lot of people responsible, and those that are being held accountable should be held accountable. But looking forward, yes, since 2000, I agree. Terrible, bashing of the other side has been what's won you elections. But history in America
you're making a very level-headed plea there, but do you not fear that once the conventions get into full swing, the temperature is going to rise again?
Yeah, that is what I'm saying. It falls to Donald J. Trump to take that temperature and be the leader that he wants to be. It will fall to him to guide the entire convention and, frankly, the rest of the campaign going forward. And if there isn't a moment like this that does that for him, I can't imagine there will be. This is his moment, and I will be looking to see what he does at the convention.
Natasha, will it motivate greater turnout amongst the voters, do you think?
I think on the Republican side, it's definitely going to motivate people to donate more to his campaign. We saw that happen after his conviction. The image of him bloody and trying to fight, to get off the stage, promotes an image that he's sort of a Teflon type of figure, that he's like Superman. I think they're going to play up that image, and he's going to, continue to gain more financial support. And I don't know how much it's going to move the meter in terms of actual support. His support base tends to go to the polls. They tend to be diehards. His polling has been at 46%. It hasn't really changed much no matter what he does. I would imagine he'd get a little bit of a bump from this as well. And of course, it affects the Democrats. It affects their strategy. They were going to go after him really hard. And as I already mentioned, they can't really do that to the same extent. They may have to change their tone.
Interesting, Rachel. What's the bottom line? Is this even more of a lose-lose outlook for Biden and the Democrats?
I think we really should be asking whether it's win-win or lose-lose for the American people. I think the American people have a chance right now to change how they're treating one another and how they're electing political leaders, and to look at, is this political leader supporting democracy and democratic institutions, or is this political leader a problem? I would say both sides of the aisle right now have problems with their political leaders and how we're electing them. And we really need to be thinking much more deeply about how to change the structures of our elections so that people have faith and trust, and so people who can get more than 50% of the American people actually win elections.
Amy, very briefly, one way of looking at this is maybe one set of things that both sides have in common. They have similar grievances, they just blame each other. Corruption of the system, right? Undermining democracy. I mean, some of the grievances are mirrored by both sides.
That's correct. And you know, so while I can agree with my side that they need to moderate that, so does the left. And it seems that both sides not only point fingers at each other, but refuse to acknowledge that they are doing the exact same thing, that they're just the other side of the same coin. And until both sides can just acknowledge that and do better, we're going to continue on this path. I hope that this will be the wake-up call that we need.
All right, let's end it on that positive outlook and hope then that both sides will see better ways forward. Let's thank our guests for joining us on this show. Big thanks to Rachel Kleinfeld and Amy Koch and Natasha Lindstaedt. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the entire team here for now is goodbye.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.